It is a gray morning on the docks of Lisbon, and you are standing in a river of people that has no end. Somewhere behind you is the house your family has lived in for 300 years, with the door left open and the fire still warm and the supper still on the table, because there was no time. Ahead of you is a ship, and beyond the ship is the ocean. And beyond the ocean is a place you have only ever heard about in tax reports and travelers' tales, a green, humid, faraway colony called Brazil. And you are about to sail to it today, right now, with whatever you could carry in your two hands. Rain is coming down. People are weeping. A nobleman near you has dropped a chest of silver into the harbor and is on his knees in the mud reaching for it. And no one stops to help him, because the drums are already beating and the tide will not wait. And out past the masts, at the very edge of the world, if you squint, you can see the dust. That gray smudge on the hills, that is Napoleon's army marching on the city. They will be here by nightfall. You are not a soldier. You are not fleeing a battle. You are watching something no European has ever seen and no European will ever see again. An entire throne, a whole royal court, 1,000 years of a kingdom, packing itself onto ships to run away across an ocean. And here is the strange part, the part I want you to hold on to. This humiliating, panicked, undignified escape is about to accidentally build a nation. Forgive me. I got carried away before I even said hello. It happens. Ask my old students. Pull up a chair. My name is Joaquim, and for the better part of 40 years I stood in front of rooms full of teenagers in Brazil, trying to make them fall in love with their own history, which is a harder job than you would think, because they had been taught it as a list of dates to memorize and forget. And of all the stories I ever told, this is the one that always did it. This is the one that made even the boy in the back row, the one drawing on his desk, look up. Because it sounds like a fairy tale, and it is completely true, and it is the hinge on which everything else in my country turns. So I am not going to give you a lecture. I am going to tell it to you the way I told it to them from memory, the way my own grandfather told it to me, with all the human mess left in. Let us go back to that dock. Let me explain how you ended up on it. To understand why a king would flee his own kingdom, you have to understand the trap he was in, and it was a beautiful, horrible trap. It is the year 1807. Napoleon Bonaparte owns most of Europe, and he has one enemy he cannot reach, one island he cannot conquer, and that is Britain. So instead of invading Britain, he decides to strangle it. He declares what history calls the continental blockade or the continental system, and the idea is simple and ruthless. Every country in Europe must close its ports to British ships. No trade. Choke the British economy until it dies. Every nation on the continent must join or be treated as an enemy of France. And there, at the far western tip of Europe, hanging off the edge of the map, is little Portugal. And Portugal has a problem because Portugal's oldest and dearest friend in all the world is Britain. They have been allies for centuries. British ships carry Portuguese wine. The British Navy protects Portuguese trade. The two crowns have leaned on each other since the Middle Ages. And now Napoleon is standing over Portugal saying, "Close your ports to your best friend, or I will destroy you." The man who has to make this impossible choice is not, technically, the king. And this is one of the strange, sad little details of the whole affair. The Queen of Portugal is Maria I, and Maria has lost her mind. History remembers her, not very kindly, as Maria the Mad. She had suffered terrible grief and terrible illness, and she was no longer able to rule, though she was still queen in name and would be until she died. So ruling in her place as Prince Regent, governing for his mother, is her son. His name is Joao, Dom Joao, and Dom Joao is, by every honest account, an anxious, cautious, indecisive man, a man who hated to be forced into anything, and who now had the entire future of his kingdom balanced on the point of a knife. Now, a student once asked me, "Professor, why did he not simply fight? He had an army. He had walls." Good question. And the honest answer is that fighting Napoleon in 1807 was not brave. It was suicide. Napoleon had crushed the greatest armies in Europe. Portugal was small and poor and not built for that kind of war. If Joao stood and fought, he would lose, and he would probably be captured or killed, and his family with him. So he did what he always did, poor man. He tried to please everyone and delay everyone. He stalled. He made secret promises to the British and quiet noises of agreement to the French, and he hoped, the way anxious people hope, that if he just waited long enough the problem would go away on its own. It did not go away. In November of 1807, Napoleon ran out of patience and sent an army over the mountains from Spain into Portugal, under a general named Junot, with one order: take Lisbon and take the royal family. Because Napoleon understood something. A king is more than a man. A king is a symbol. If he could capture the Portuguese royal family, he could put them in his pocket and rule Portugal through them like puppets, the way he was doing with half of Europe. And that is the knife at Joao's throat in those last November days. Junot's army is marching, getting closer every hour, and the roads are bad and the soldiers are hungry and exhausted, but they are coming. And Dom Joao, the man who could never make a decision, finally has to make the biggest one any Portuguese ruler has ever made. And here is where it gets interesting, because the escape was not a mad, sudden, last-second idea. This is something the school books rush past. The idea of a Portuguese king sailing to Brazil if Europe ever became too dangerous, that idea was old. It had been floated by advisors and thinkers for generations. This notion that Portugal's true treasure, its future, was not the little strip of land in Europe but the enormous, rich, barely tapped giant across the ocean. Brazil was bigger than the mother country many times over. It had gold, it had sugar, it had endless land. Some had whispered for years, "The real Portugal is over there. If the old one ever falls, go build the empire anew in the tropics." So when the moment came, there was a plan on the shelf, dusty but ready. And with Junot's soldiers practically at the gates, Dom Joao took it down and blew off the dust and gave the order that nobody quite believed until they saw it happen. The court is leaving. All of it. We are going to Brazil. Not the king alone. Not a few ministers. The entire apparatus of a European monarchy, lifted up whole and carried across the sea. And they had, by most accounts, about 2 days to do it. Imagine trying to move a government, an entire royal household, in 48 hours. Imagine what goes on your ship and what you leave behind forever. The docks of Lisbon in those last days of November 1807 were pure, weeping chaos. And this is the scene I opened with. So now you know why the people were crying. Because the call had gone out, and the nobility, the ministers, the priests, the clerks, the servants, anyone attached to the crown, all came pouring down to the water with whatever they could carry. And the ships could not take everything. Carriages were abandoned in the streets. Trunks of belongings were left on the quay because there was no room. Families were separated in the crush, some getting aboard, some left behind on the shore to face the French. There are accounts of precious things dropped into the harbor in the panic and simply lost. And it was not only people. This is the part that tells you it was a whole civilization moving, not just a family running. They loaded the royal treasury, the money of the state. They loaded the state archives, the paperwork of a kingdom, its records and its laws. They loaded the contents of the royal library, tens of thousands of books and manuscripts, though a good part of that great library, they say, had to be left behind in the rush and was sent on later. They were trying to carry the soul of a country in the hold of a ship. How many people, in total? Here I have to be honest with you, because I promised I would, and because accuracy is the whole reason to bother telling true stories instead of making them up. The numbers you will read vary from source to source. By most accounts, it was somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 people, aboard a fleet of, again by most counts, well over a dozen ships, perhaps closer to 2 or 3 dozen depending on how you count the smaller vessels and the merchant ships that joined. Do not let anyone give you one clean, confident number. The honest answer is that it was a huge, hastily counted crowd, but hold the shape of it in your mind. 10 to 15,000 souls, a floating nation, and who was waiting to guard this desperate flotilla as it crawled out of the mouth of the river? The British. The very friend Napoleon had ordered Portugal to abandon. The British Navy, the most powerful fleet in the world, was sitting off the Portuguese coast, and they had a keen interest in this escape succeeding, because a Portuguese royal family safe in Brazil, friendly to Britain and opening the doors of a giant new market, was worth far more to London than a Portuguese royal family sitting captive in Napoleon's pocket. So the Royal Navy escorted the fleet out and shepherded it across the Atlantic. And so, on roughly the 29th of November, 1807, with the enemy's army entering the city almost as the last sails cleared the harbor, the throne of Portugal put out to sea. There is a detail I love, and I cannot fully prove it, so I flag it as the kind of thing that may be part legend. It is said Junot's soldiers reached the heights over Lisbon just in time to watch the last Portuguese ships disappearing over the horizon. To have marched all that way to seize a king, and to arrive and find nothing but an empty palace and a cold supper, and a smudge of sails vanishing into the Atlantic. Whether it happened exactly so or not, it is the perfect image, because it is exactly what happened to the plan. Napoleon reached out to grab the crown of Portugal, and his hand closed on the sea. But do not for 1 second imagine that escape was the same as safety. The ocean does not care that you are a duchess. The crossing was brutal. This was the Atlantic in a wooden sailing ship, packed far beyond comfort with people who had never been to sea, many of them nobles who had never in their pampered lives known real hardship. Storms scattered the fleet, so that ships lost sight of one another for days, and each captain had to make his own way. Seasickness swept through the passengers. Food and fresh water grew short and grew foul. And then there is the detail that my students always shrieked at, which is why I always include it: the lice. In the heat and the filth and the crush of bodies, the fine ladies of the court became infested with lice, and it got so bad that many of them had to shave their heads, these elegant women of the Portuguese court arriving in the New World bald under their bonnets. There is your fairy tale. There is your glamorous royal voyage. Bald, seasick, terrified, and lost at sea. The crossing took roughly 2 months, and after all of it, the first land they touched was not even their destination. On the 22nd of January, 1808, the ship carrying Dom Joao dropped anchor at Salvador in Bahia in the north of Brazil. Salvador had once been the colonial capital, an old and proud city, and it went absolutely wild with joy. Their king, or as near as made no difference, their Prince Regent, had come to them. To this distant colony that Lisbon had ruled from across the ocean for 3 centuries, treating it as a source of gold and sugar and little else. The actual sovereign had arrived in person. It was unheard of. It was miraculous. They rang the bells and they held feasts, and they could hardly believe their eyes. And here in Salvador, before he had even gone on to the city that would become his capital, before he had unpacked, Dom Joao did something that changed Brazil forever. This is the first great act, and I want you to understand why it mattered so much. On the 28th of January, 1808, just 6 days after landing, Dom Joao signed a decree opening the ports of Brazil to trade with all friendly nations. Now, that sounds like a piece of dull paperwork. It was an earthquake, because for 300 years, the iron rule of the colonial system had been that Brazil could only trade with Portugal. Everything Brazil grew or dug or made had to be sold through the mother country. Everything Brazil bought had to be bought through the mother country. The whole point of a colony, in that old brutal logic, was to be a captive market, a thing squeezed for the benefit of the homeland. And with one signature, cornered on a dock in Bahia, Dom Joao smashed that 300-year monopoly. Suddenly, Brazilian ports were open to the ships of the world, above all to the British. Suddenly, Brazil was not a locked warehouse. It was a country that could trade. Why did he do it? Partly he had no choice. His trade with occupied Portugal was cut off, and he owed the British an enormous favor. But intention hardly matters next to the result. In one stroke, the colony had been handed the economic keys to its own house. From Salvador, the fleet sailed on down the coast to the city that Joao had chosen for his capital. And on the 7th and 8th of March, 1808, the court finally arrived at Rio de Janeiro. And with that, something happened that had never happened before in the history of the world, and never has since. Sit with this, because it is the true heart of the whole story. For the first and only time, a European monarchy was going to rule its entire empire from one of its colonies. The capital of the Portuguese Empire, of all its lands in Africa and Asia and the Americas, was now Rio de Janeiro, not Lisbon, Rio. A colonial port on the far side of the ocean had become the beating heart of a global empire, the seat of the throne. The tail was now wagging the dog, and it would never fully wag back. But let me bring you down to street level, because from street level it looked less like a miracle and more like an invasion. Rio de Janeiro in 1808 was a colonial town, a big one, an important one, but a town, with muddy streets and modest houses, and nowhere near enough room to suddenly absorb 10,000 or more nobles, ministers, courtiers, and their servants who had just poured off the ships expecting to live like the aristocrats they were. Where do you put them all? The answer was not gentle. Royal officials went through the city marking out the best houses to be seized for the use of the court. And they marked them, so the story goes, by chalking 2 letters on the door, P and R, for Prince Regent, meaning this house is now requisitioned for the crown. Get out. And the people of Rio, who found their homes suddenly taken over their heads, had a bitter little joke about what those 2 letters really stood for. PR, they said, does not mean Prince Regent. It means Panhasi na Rua. Put yourself out in the street. Get out. I always loved that joke because it tells you the truth that the grand paintings leave out. To the ordinary people of Rio, the arrival of the king was not only glory and bells. It was also thousands of hungry, demanding newcomers and the loss of their own front doors. Great history is always also somebody losing their house. And yet, here is where the story turns, and turns hard, into something no one on that panicked dock in Lisbon could possibly have imagined. Because Dom Joao, this anxious, indecisive man who had been chased across an ocean, now found himself the ruler of an empire that had to be governed from a colonial town that had none of the machinery a capital needs. And so he built it, almost overnight, in a burst of creation that genuinely amazes me every time I go back to it. He conjured up the institutions of a modern nation where there had been almost nothing. He founded the Banco do Brasil, the Bank of Brazil, in 1808, the country's first true bank. He established a printing press, the Imprensa Regia, the royal press, and I need you to understand how enormous that is, because printing had been forbidden in Brazil. For 3 centuries, the colony was not allowed to print a single page. No newspapers, no books, no pamphlets, nothing, because an unlettered colony is an obedient colony. And now, suddenly, Brazil could print. Ideas could be set in type. A public that reads is a public that thinks, and a public that thinks is the seed of everything that comes after. He brought the Royal Library, tens of thousands of volumes, and made it the foundation of a great national library. He founded a botanical garden in Rio, which still stands today, one of the loveliest in the world. He established a military academy to train officers. He founded the first medical schools, the beginnings of higher education and real medicine in the country, in Bahia and in Rio. And it did not stop with the grand institutions. The court itself, all those thousands of new mouths and new tastes, transformed the city around it. New shops opened to sell the things a court expects. Craftsmen and merchants and teachers and doctors were drawn to Rio because that is where the money and the power now lived. Streets were paved, gardens laid out, theaters built. A sleepy colonial port grew, almost against its will, into a real capital, with the noise and the trade and the ambition that a capital carries. Do you see what is happening? A colony is a place kept deliberately dependent, deliberately empty of its own institutions, so that it always needs the mother country. And in the space of a few years, to serve his own displaced court, Dom Joao accidentally filled that emptiness. He gave Brazil a bank, a press, a library, schools, an academy, the bones of a state. He was not trying to liberate anybody. He was trying to make Rio comfortable enough to rule from. But you cannot give a country the tools of nationhood and expect it to stay a colony forever. And then, in 1815, he made it official in a way that stunned the old world. By then, Napoleon had been defeated in Europe, and the kings and diplomats of the continent were redrawing the map. And in the middle of all that, Dom Joao raised Brazil up from the status of a colony to the status of a kingdom, co-equal with Portugal itself. The state was now called the United Kingdom of Portugal, Brazil, and the Algarves. Think about those words. A colony had become a kingdom. The thing that existed to be exploited was now a partner, legally equal to the mother country. There was no going back from that. You cannot tell a place it is a kingdom, give it a bank and a press and a library and a throne, and then, a few years later, tell it to go back to being a warehouse. History does not run backward that easily. But run backward is exactly what Portugal tried to make it do. And this is the last turn of the screw, the one that seals the whole thing. Old Queen Maria, the Mad Queen, died in Brazil in 1816, and Dom Joao at last became king in his own right, King Joao VI. But back in Portugal, things had curdled. The mother country had suffered terribly in the war, and then it had suffered the strange humiliation of watching its own king rule from the colony and pour his attention and his money into Brazil while Lisbon sat neglected. In 1820, there was a liberal revolution in Portugal, and the revolutionaries demanded 2 things: a constitution, and their king back home where he belonged. And not so quietly, they wanted Brazil put back in its box, demoted from a kingdom to a colony once more. So in 1821, after 13 years in Brazil, Joao VI sailed back to Portugal. But he did not take everything with him this time, and here is the masterstroke, whether by wisdom or by accident. He left his son behind in Brazil as regent to govern in his place, a young man named Pedro. And there is a line attributed to old Joao as he prepared to leave that history has never quite let go of because it is too perfect. He is supposed to have taken his son aside and said, in effect, "Pedro, if Brazil is going to break away and become independent, and I fear it is, then let it be you who takes the crown, one of us, rather than some adventurer. Take it for yourself, before someone takes it against us." Now, historians debate the exact words, as they always do with a line that good, so take the wording as tradition rather than a transcript. But the sense of it captured the moment exactly, because when the government back in Lisbon tried to force Brazil back down into a colony, tried to strip away its institutions and order young Pedro to come home to Brazil, which had spent 13 years being a kingdom with a bank and a press and a court and a taste of running its own affairs, simply refused. And Pedro refused with it. There is a famous day, the 9th of January 1822, when Pedro was ordered home and answered that he would stay, a day remembered as the Dia do Fico, the day of I stay. And then, on the 7th of September, 1822, by the banks of a small stream called the Ipiranga, Pedro made it final. He declared Brazil independent from Portugal, in the cry that every Brazilian schoolchild learns, the Grito do Ipiranga, the cry of Ipiranga, independence or death. And he did not become a president of a republic. He became an emperor. Dom Pedro I, Emperor of Brazil, the son of the man who had fled across the ocean in a panic 14 years earlier, was now the ruler of a free and independent Brazilian empire. And Brazil, almost alone among the nations of the Americas, won its independence not through a long and bloody revolutionary war against a foreign crown, but through a prince of that very crown turning around and leading the split himself. It was, comparatively, one of the least violent births of any great nation, and it traces, in an unbroken line, straight back to that weeping dock in Lisbon. So now let me say plainly the thing this whole story has been circling. Everyone at the time understood the flight of 1808 as a humiliation, a defeat, the lowest moment in the history of the Portuguese crown. Picture it as they saw it, a king, or the man ruling as one, so cornered, so frightened, so powerless before Napoleon, that he abandoned his own capital in the night and ran across an ocean rather than stand and fight. His enemies laughed. His own people wept on the docks. It looked, by every measure of the moment, like the end of something, like the collapse of a kingdom. And yet that panicked flight is precisely what built modern Brazil. The escape that looked like a death was the birth. Because the crown fleeing to Rio is what opened the ports and shattered the colonial monopoly. It is what gave the colony a bank, a printing press, a library, universities, an academy, the institutions of a real country. It is what turned Rio from a warehouse into a capital. It is what raised Brazil to a kingdom, and it is what left a prince on Brazilian soil to declare the nation free. Take away 1808, take away that humiliating run for the ships, and the whole story of Brazilian independence has to be rewritten from scratch, and probably far more bloodily. The defeat was the foundation. The lowest moment was the cornerstone. And this, my friend, is why I could never stop telling this story to those bored teenagers, and why I am telling it now to you, because it does something to how you see your own life if you let it. We are all so certain in the moment that we know a disaster when we see one. The job you lost, the plan that collapsed, the door that slammed, the day you had to abandon the whole life you had built and start again somewhere strange, with only what you could carry in your two hands. In the moment, every one of those feels like an ending, like the smudge of the enemy's army on the hill, and sometimes it truly is a loss, and I would never wave that away. Those people weeping on the dock were really losing their homes, and some of them never got them back. But how often, looking back, do we find that the thing we ran to in a panic became the ground we built the rest of our lives on? How often does a nation's whole founding, or a whole life's real chapter, turn out to be hiding inside what everyone at the time was absolutely sure was a defeat? Dom Joao did not sail to Brazil to found a nation. He sailed there to save his own skin. He was not a hero. He was a frightened man making the least bad choice in front of him. And it changed the world anyway. That is the part they leave out of the school book, the part I always wanted my students to carry out of the room with them. Not the date, not the names, just this, that you very often cannot tell in the moment it is happening whether you are living through the worst day of your story or the first day of the best part of it. So that is my question for you, and I do read the comments, I promise, so tell me. Has there ever been a moment in your own life that felt, at the time, like a disaster, a flight, an ending, and only years later did you understand that it was actually the beginning of something you would not trade away for anything? I would truly love to know. Write it down below and I will read it. And if you enjoyed sitting with me for this one, if you like your history told slowly and honestly, with the human mess left in and the tall tales flagged as tall tales, then do an old teacher a kindness and subscribe, so I can pull up a chair again next time and tell you another one. Because believe me, the history of Brazil is full of these. A country this large, born this strangely, has more of them than I have years left to tell. My name is Joaquim. Mind how you read the map of your own troubles, and I will see you next time.